Something shifted in the quiet hours last night, and the person you love could no longer pretend that everything inside them was calm. It was not a dramatic scene anyone else would have noticed. There was no crowd around them, no perfect speech prepared, no sudden answer arriving at exactly the right moment. There was simply a room that felt unusually still, a phone resting nearby, and a person who had spent far too long trying to stay composed finally realizing that some emotions become heavier when they are continually hidden. And this is where you need to listen carefully, because what affected them was not what you might immediately assume. It was not simply loneliness. It was not one argument replaying in their mind. It was not even the distance between the two of you by itself. Something much more personal surfaced, something they had been avoiding because acknowledging it would force them to see your connection differently. Don't skip, because the smallest detail from last night may explain why they are now wishing you could understand what they could not bring themselves to say directly. For a while, they had convinced themselves that silence was maturity. They told themselves that giving things time would somehow make the confusing emotions disappear. They believed that if they stayed busy enough, laughed at the right moments, answered people normally, and carried on with ordinary life, whatever they still felt for you would eventually settle into something easier to manage. Yet certain feelings do not disappear simply because someone becomes good at hiding them. Sometimes they become clearer. Sometimes absence removes the noise and leaves only the truth. And last night, that truth became difficult for them to ignore. There was one moment, small enough that another person might have forgotten it immediately, that brought you back into their thoughts with unexpected force. Maybe it was a familiar song playing somewhere nearby. Maybe it was a photograph they had not looked at in a long time. Maybe their phone suggested an old memory. Maybe someone casually repeated a phrase you once used. The exact object matters less than what happened inside them afterward. Because suddenly, they were no longer remembering the complicated parts first. They were remembering how safe certain conversations with you once felt. They remembered the strange ease of being understood without having to explain every detail. They remembered moments that seemed ordinary when they happened but became precious only after enough time had passed. And that realization unsettled them. Not because it was frightening, but because it challenged the story they had been telling themselves. They had spent so much time thinking the connection needed to be analyzed, defined, controlled, or even forgotten that they had overlooked something simple. You mattered to them in ways they had never properly expressed. Stay till the end, because the reason they became emotional was not merely that they missed you. Missing someone can be temporary. What happened last night went deeper. They began remembering moments when you were trying to reach them emotionally and they did not fully recognize what you were offering. They remembered times when your patience looked ordinary because they had grown accustomed to it. They remembered moments when you gave them room instead of demanding answers. They remembered the little ways you tried to make things lighter when they were carrying something heavy. And suddenly they could see those memories from the other side. That is when their composure began to weaken. There is a particular kind of emotion that arrives when a person recognizes value after distance has made it visible. It is not about punishment. It is not about regret swallowing everything. It is simply clarity arriving later than expected. And clarity can be incredibly quiet. Sometimes it looks like someone sitting motionless for several minutes because they have finally understood why a certain person keeps returning to their mind. Sometimes it looks like opening a message, typing 3 words, deleting them, and putting the phone down again. Sometimes it looks like whispering something nobody else hears. Why didn't I understand this then? That question stayed with them last night. And here is where the story begins to change. They were not only thinking about what happened between you. They were thinking about who they had been when it happened. That distinction matters. Because for the first time, instead of asking whether you should have done something differently, they began wondering whether they had been emotionally prepared to receive what you were giving. Perhaps they were distracted. Perhaps they were protecting themselves. Perhaps they confused vulnerability with weakness. Perhaps they assumed there would always be another conversation, another chance, another ordinary day to say what mattered. And suddenly they understood something most people only learn after life becomes quieter: meaningful connections are rarely lost in one dramatic moment. More often, they fade through tiny unsaid things, postponed conversations, misunderstood intentions, and feelings that both people hope the other somehow already knows. Something important is waiting for you in this realization, because the person you love began to see that the distance itself had been teaching them what closeness once meant. Think about that for a moment. Sometimes a person cannot recognize peace while standing inside it. They only understand its value after everything becomes noisier without it. Sometimes someone does not realize how deeply another person influenced their life until they notice themselves comparing every new conversation to the honesty they once shared with you. That comparison had been happening quietly. They had not admitted it. They probably would not have known how to explain it even if someone asked. But last night, when the distractions finally faded, those comparisons became impossible to overlook. They remembered your voice. They remembered a certain expression on your face. They remembered how you could tell something was wrong even when they insisted they were fine. And then came the thought that broke through the emotional wall they had spent so long building: what if they thought I never cared? That question changed the atmosphere inside them. Because the truth was not that they never cared. The truth was that caring made everything more complicated for them than they knew how to admit. There are people who speak easily when something means very little, then become strangely quiet when something matters deeply. They can explain work, plans, frustrations, ordinary events, but when affection becomes real, language suddenly feels dangerous because every sentence reveals something. The person you love may have spent far too much time trying to find the perfect moment to express imperfect feelings. And last night they understood that waiting for perfect words had created exactly the misunderstanding they never wanted. Their emotion rose slowly. First came memory. Then came recognition. Then came the realization that you may have experienced their silence very differently from how they intended it. They began imagining the moments when you waited for reassurance that never arrived. The moments you wondered whether the connection meant as much to them as it did to you. The moments you perhaps stepped back because you did not want to chase clarity from someone who seemed uncertain. And they finally understood why you may have protected your own heart by becoming quieter too. That understanding did not make them blame themselves endlessly. Instead, something softer happened. They began wanting to explain. Not defend. Not rewrite history. Explain. There is a difference. Defense says, here is why I was right. Explanation says, here is what was happening inside me that I never knew how to show you. And that is closer to what they are carrying now. Please watch this, not because some impossible event is about to occur, but because the real reason behind their emotions could change how you understand the silence between you. They are beginning to realize that what they wanted from you was never perfection. It was presence. And somewhere along the way, they became afraid that wanting your presence gave you too much importance in their life. So they pulled back. They tried to appear less affected. They answered more casually than they felt. They convinced themselves that emotional control meant emotional strength. Yet last night they saw the cost of that performance. They saw how pretending not to care can eventually make the person you care about believe you. That realization hit them harder than any argument could have. For several moments, they simply sat with it. And then they reached for their phone. Here is the detail I want you to notice. They did not immediately contact you. Their hand stopped. Their screen lit up. Your name, or perhaps a reminder of you, felt suddenly more powerful than usual. They considered opening the door they had kept closed. They imagined what they would say if you answered. They imagined your silence too. And then came hesitation. Not because the feeling disappeared. Because now the feeling had become real enough to risk something. What if they said too much? What if they said too little? What if you had already moved emotionally beyond the point where their explanation mattered? What if reopening the conversation caused confusion instead of peace? These were not excuses anymore. They were signs that they understood your feelings mattered too. And that is one of the quiet changes taking place inside them. Earlier, they may have been focused on protecting themselves from discomfort. Last night, they started thinking about how any future conversation would affect you. They realized that reaching out simply to ease their own emotions would be unfair. If they spoke, they wanted the words to carry responsibility. They wanted to acknowledge what had gone unsaid. They wanted to avoid promising things they were not ready to live. They wanted to speak in a way that did not demand anything from you. And perhaps that is why the message they kept imagining was so simple: please hear me for a moment. There is something I finally understand. Notice the shift. They are not imagining a grand declaration. They are imagining honesty. And honesty is far more meaningful than drama. A grand declaration can disappear tomorrow. Honest self-awareness can change the way two people finally understand their entire story. Don't skip this next part, because here is the realization that truly brought their emotions to the surface. It was not only the fear of losing you. It was the possibility that they had already made you question something that should never have needed to be questioned, whether your presence had mattered. They suddenly wanted you to know that it did. The late-night conversations mattered. The small kindnesses mattered. The way you remembered details mattered. The way you stayed gentle when they were confused mattered. Even the moments when you stepped away mattered, because those moments forced them to confront themselves rather than leaning on your patience forever. And what they understood last night was this: sometimes the person who changes you most is not the person who gives you every answer. It is the person whose absence makes you finally begin asking the right questions. You became connected, in their mind, to questions they can no longer avoid. What do I really want? Why did I become distant when closeness was offered? Why was I afraid to say what I felt? Why did I assume there would always be more time? And perhaps the hardest one, if I had one honest conversation with them now, what would I finally admit? They sat with that last question longer than the others. The answer did not arrive as one perfect sentence. It arrived in pieces. I would admit that I noticed more than I ever said. I would admit that their absence changed the atmosphere of certain days. I would admit that I replayed conversations I pretended to forget. I would admit that I cared even while acting uncertain. I would admit that I sometimes pushed away the very connection I secretly wanted to feel safe inside. And then another thought appeared. The thought that brought tears they had been holding back. Maybe they needed to hear this when I was still too afraid to say it. That was the heart of last night. Not some sensational secret. Not betrayal. Not a hidden life. The real reason changes everything because it reframes the story. Their breakdown was not caused by discovering something terrible about you. It came from discovering something honest about themselves. They finally recognized the difference between losing interest and losing courage. They had not necessarily stopped feeling. They had stopped knowing what to do with the feeling. And those are very different things. But something else happened after that realization, something quieter, and possibly more important. Their thoughts stopped circling around the past and turned toward what an honest future would actually require. They began asking themselves whether they were ready to communicate differently, whether they could show consistency instead of emotion only when distance became painful, whether they could listen without becoming defensive, whether they could meet you as you are now instead of trying to return to an old version of the connection. Because they know, deep down, that you may have changed too. You may have become calmer, more discerning, less willing to accept confusion, more protective of your peace. And strangely, instead of pushing them away emotionally, that possibility made them respect you more. They began to understand that loving someone does not mean expecting them to remain exactly where you left them. If they ever step toward you again, they may need to meet the person you have become. And that means the next chapter cannot simply repeat the old one. Stay till the end of this thought, because this is where they're begging, please watch this. Takes on its real meaning. What they wish you could see is not their tears. It is the understanding behind them. They do not want your sympathy. They want you to know that something inside them finally became clear. They want you to see that your kindness was not invisible, even if they once acted as though it was ordinary. They want you to know that the connection was not one-sided simply because they struggled to express themselves. And most of all, they want you to understand that silence sometimes hides confusion, not indifference. But there is still one thing they have not resolved. One question remains open, and it is the question keeping them from simply pressing send. They know what they would like to say now. They know what they finally understand. What they do not yet know is whether speaking would bring you peace, or reopen something you have worked hard to make sense of. And for the first time, they are not asking only what they want. They are asking what would be fair to you. That is why the next decision matters so much. Because somewhere between last night's emotion and the message still waiting inside them, they realize there is one sentence they owe you, whether the two of you ever return to what you once were or not. One sentence that is less about getting you back and more about giving you the truth you deserve to hear from the beginning. And when you understand what that sentence is, the entire meaning of their silence may look very different. There is a strange moment that comes after someone finally understands what they should have said long ago, because the discovery itself is only half of the journey. The harder part is deciding whether they now have the courage to say it without expecting anything in return. That is where the person you love found themselves after the emotion of last night began to settle. The room was still the same. The phone was still nearby. Nothing outside had visibly changed. Yet inside them, something had moved into a place it could no longer be pushed back from. They had reached the point where pretending not to know what they felt would require more effort than simply admitting it. And the sentence they kept returning to was surprisingly simple: "You mattered to me more than I ever let you know." Not, "You were perfect." Not, "Everything should go back to how it was." Not some enormous promise designed to erase the complicated parts. Just that. "You mattered to me more than I ever let you know." Stay with that for a moment, because this is where the real reason behind their emotions begins to deepen. They were not only thinking about you as someone they missed. They were thinking about the version of themselves that existed around you. There were qualities you quietly brought forward in them that they barely recognized at the time. Around you, perhaps they laughed more naturally. Perhaps they spoke about things they usually kept private. Perhaps they felt understood before they fully understood themselves. Maybe you challenged them gently when they were avoiding something important. Maybe you believed in possibilities they were too uncertain to believe in yet. And after enough distance, they noticed something unexpected: certain parts of themselves felt quieter without you. That realization is different from simply wanting someone back. It is the recognition that a connection left an imprint. And once they admitted that, another memory surfaced, one they had avoided because it carried too much meaning. It was a moment when you gave them an opportunity to be honest. Maybe you asked a simple question. Maybe you looked at them in a way that made it obvious you already knew there was something beneath the surface. Maybe you said, "You can tell me." And instead of opening up, they changed the subject. They smiled. They made the moment smaller than it really was. At the time, they thought they were protecting themselves. Last night, they finally understood that they may have been protecting themselves from the very intimacy they secretly wanted. Don't skip, because this is where their understanding became almost painfully clear. They began to see a pattern. Whenever the connection became meaningful enough to require vulnerability, they stepped backward. Whenever you became important enough that losing you would hurt, they acted as though they needed less. Whenever they wanted reassurance, they became more distant instead of asking for it. And perhaps you interpreted that distance as a message. Of course you did. Most people would. Actions create meaning even when someone's intentions are completely different. They finally saw that. They saw how confusing it must have been to receive warmth one day and hesitation the next. They saw how exhausting uncertainty can become when someone refuses to name what is happening. And they realized something else that changed the way they remembered you: you may have stayed longer than they understood. You may have given them chances they barely recognized as chances because they assumed your presence was guaranteed. There were probably moments when you were already tired, already wondering whether you should protect your peace, already questioning how much longer you could carry a connection that required so much interpretation. Yet you still offered kindness. You still tried to understand. And now they can see that your patience was not endless because you cared less about yourself. It was generous because you cared deeply. That realization made them stop romanticizing the past. This matters. They are not only remembering beautiful moments and pretending the difficult parts never happened. Instead, they are beginning to understand both. The warmth and the confusion. The closeness and the hesitation. The possibility and the missed opportunities. And because they can finally hold both truths at once, something inside them is becoming more mature. They are beginning to understand that caring about someone is not enough by itself. Care has to become communication. Affection has to become consistency. Good intentions have to become choices another person can actually feel. Otherwise, even a meaningful bond can slowly become impossible to trust. Something important is waiting for you here, because the person you love is no longer asking themselves only, "Do I still have feelings?" That question became too easy. They know the answer now. The more difficult question is, am I capable of showing those feelings in a way that creates peace instead of confusion? That question stopped them. Because suddenly this was not about sending one emotional message at midnight. It was about whether they could become different after sending it. Anyone can feel deeply for one evening. Anyone can miss someone after looking through old memories. Anyone can type a beautiful paragraph when emotion is high. But could they show up differently tomorrow? Could they communicate when things were uncomfortable instead of disappearing into silence? Could they be clear instead of leaving you to guess? Could they respect your boundaries if your answer was not what they hoped? Could they approach you without making you responsible for healing every emotion they had been avoiding? These questions mattered to them now, and that is why they did not rush. Perhaps an earlier version of them would have reached out immediately just to relieve the pressure in their chest. But something had changed. They understood that contacting you should not merely make them feel better. It should honor you too. That is where the words, "Please watch this," truly become meaningful. What they are begging you to see is not an emotional performance. They want you to see the change in perspective. They want you to understand that the distance forced them to recognize what their silence created. They want you to know they finally see that you were not asking for impossible perfection. Perhaps you were simply asking to know where you stood. Perhaps you wanted honesty, even if the honesty was imperfect. Perhaps you could have handled uncertainty if they had named it instead of hiding behind mixed signals. That realization stayed with them like a quiet echo. They weren't asking me to know everything. They were asking me to be real. And once that thought appeared, another followed immediately. Why was being real with them so difficult? The answer surprised them. It was not because they trusted you too little. It may have been because they trusted the connection enough that losing it suddenly felt possible. Some people become more expressive when they care. Others become careful. They overthink every sentence. They anticipate rejection before it happens. They imagine how foolish they might feel if they reveal too much. They confuse emotional restraint with safety. And eventually they create the distance they were afraid of in the first place. Last night, the person you love recognized pieces of that pattern in themselves. It did not excuse everything. They knew that. But understanding the pattern gave them something they had not possessed before, a chance to interrupt it. And then came another unexpected realization. They started thinking about the last time you seemed different around them. Maybe your replies became shorter. Maybe your warmth became more measured. Maybe you stopped asking the questions you once asked. Maybe you simply stopped trying to pull honesty from someone who kept hiding behind uncertainty. At the time, they may have told themselves you were changing for no reason. They may have felt confused by your distance without connecting it to their own. Now they can see it differently. Perhaps you were not becoming cold. Instead of thinking, "How do I get them to come back?" they began thinking, "If I speak to them, how do I make sure I do not repeat what hurt them before?" That is a very different question. One is about possession. The other is about responsibility. And the second question frightened them a little, not because it was negative, but because it demanded change rather than words. If they reached out, they knew they could no longer hide behind vague phrases. They could not simply say, "I miss you," and expect the entire story to repair itself. Missing you would not explain everything. They would have to tell you what they finally understood. They would have to acknowledge the moments when they disappeared emotionally even while physically present. They would have to admit that they sometimes waited for you to read feelings they were unwilling to express. They would have to recognize that your confusion did not come from nowhere. And perhaps most importantly, they would have to give you the freedom to respond however you genuinely felt. That last part was difficult. Because once someone becomes honest, they often secretly hope honesty guarantees the outcome they want. But it does not. Honesty opens a door, it cannot force another person to walk through it. They understand that more clearly now. And strangely, accepting that made the message inside them become more sincere. Instead of imagining how to convince you, they started imagining how to tell you the truth without placing pressure on you. The words changed. "I need you back" became, "I want you to understand something." "You have to give me another chance" became, "I understand if you need time." "Everything was a mistake" became, "There are things I should have communicated differently." And somewhere between those sentences, the person you love began to sound less like someone reacting to loneliness and more like someone finally confronting their own heart. But then something happened that they were not prepared for. As they scrolled through an old conversation, they found a message from you that they had read many times before, but this time it looked completely different. Maybe the message was gentle. Maybe it was only a few words. Perhaps you had said something like, "I just wish you would tell me what you're actually feeling." At the time, they may have skimmed past it, answered around it, or convinced themselves there would be a better moment later. Last night, those simple words landed differently. They could finally hear the vulnerability behind them. They could see that you had not been demanding certainty. You had been asking for access to the truth. And suddenly they understood what that message must have cost you to send. They imagined you typing it, wondering whether you were asking too much, hoping they would meet you halfway. Then they remembered how they responded, or perhaps how they failed to respond. That was the moment their emotions rose again. Not because they wanted to punish themselves, but because hindsight had finally given them your perspective. They whispered something quietly, almost as though speaking to the past. "You were trying to reach me." That sentence stayed in the room. You were trying to reach me. And maybe, in your own way, you were. Not dramatically. Not endlessly. Just enough to let them know the door was open if they were willing to walk through it. But they had been so consumed with their own uncertainty that they mistook your invitation for pressure. Now they understood. And with that understanding came one of the rarest realizations of all. Sometimes people do not lose meaningful connections because they stop caring. Sometimes they lose them because they keep waiting to feel completely ready before showing up honestly. But readiness does not always arrive first. Sometimes courage has to come before certainty. The person you love finally saw that. Something important is waiting for you in what happened next. They closed the old conversation. They put the phone down. And instead of immediately drowning themselves in distraction again, they stayed with the feeling. They allowed themselves to miss you without turning the missing into desperation. They allowed themselves to regret certain choices without turning regret into self-condemnation. They allowed themselves to imagine a future conversation without scripting your response. This was new. Because previously, their mind had always tried to control every possibility. If I say this, what will they say? If I reach out, what happens next? If they do not respond immediately, what does that mean? But last night they stopped trying to predict you. They started preparing to be honest regardless of the outcome. And that was when one particular sentence formed clearly enough that they knew it was the truth. I don't want to contact them just because I'm afraid of losing them. I want to contact them because they deserve to know what was real. That is the real reason everything changed. Fear asks someone to grab. Love asks someone to tell the truth and respect what happens afterward. And they are slowly moving from the first toward the second. They may still be nervous. They may still rewrite the message 10 times. They may still stare at your name and wonder whether now is the right moment. But something about their intention has changed. They are no longer trying to escape discomfort. They are trying to become clear enough that if they speak, their words mean something. And there is another detail you may not expect. During all of this, they began remembering not only what you gave them but something they gave you too. They remembered times when you trusted them. Times when you relaxed around them. Times when you allowed them to see parts of you that not everyone saw. They realized your vulnerability was also a gift, and perhaps they had become so focused on their own fear that they never fully understood the responsibility that came with receiving yours. That thought changed the way they imagined approaching you. They did not want to arrive with a dramatic emotional storm and ask you to carry it. They wanted to come calmly. To tell the truth. To acknowledge the past. To listen. Maybe even to apologize without turning the apology into a request for immediate forgiveness. Because an apology is most meaningful when it does not secretly contain a demand. And now, for the first time, they can see that. Don't skip this realization, because it explains why the message has still not been sent exactly the way they first imagined. They wrote something last night. Maybe not a finished message. Maybe a note. Maybe just a few sentences sitting unsent. They started with your name. They deleted it. They wrote, "I've been thinking about you." Deleted that too. They tried again. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago." They stared at the sentence. It felt closer. Then another line followed, "You never imagined what you meant to me because I never gave you enough reason to know." And when they read those words back, they stopped. Because that was it. That was the truth they had been circling all night. You may not have misunderstood their feelings because you were incapable of seeing them. You may have misunderstood because they concealed them. They finally accepted responsibility for that. And acceptance created a strange kind of peace inside them. Not complete peace. Not certainty. But the calm that appears when someone stops arguing with reality. They could no longer say, "You should have known." They knew now that people deserve to be told. Love should not become an emotional puzzle another person has to solve. Care should not require constant interpretation. And if they ever receive another opportunity with you, even if that opportunity is only one honest conversation, they want to make sure you do not have to guess. But just when they thought they understood everything last night was trying to show them, another memory returned, one connected to the final conversation between you, or perhaps one of the last moments before the distance grew. There was something you said that seemed ordinary then but now feels like it carried an entirely different meaning. They remembered the exact tone. The pause afterward. The way you seemed to be waiting for something they never gave you. And suddenly they realized that perhaps you had already told them exactly what you needed. They simply were not ready to hear it. That memory is now changing the message they are preparing, because it contains a clue about what you may need from them today, not what they assume you need, but what you quietly asked for all along. And when they finally understand that clue completely, the next thing they choose to say may surprise even them.